All right, guys, welcome back. This is the World War I lecture, The End of the War, and Treaty of Versailles for Macias's class, World History. All right, as with the other video lectures, you have your packet of notes. Go ahead and record your notes. And remember, since it's a video lecture, you can pause as you need to make sure that you can get down all the information that you need. Okay? So let's go ahead and get started. I will pause briefly after I stop narration for each slide so that you'll know when it's time to pause. Okay, here we go. All right, so we are in late 1918. Okay, we know that the U.S. joined the war in 1917 and provided much needed relief for the Allies who were starting to run low on supplies and starting to run low on troops. The Germans were experiencing similar hardships, but they had been able to take the Russians out of the war with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and so now the threat of the two-front war for Germany had been eliminated, meaning that they could concentrate more of their efforts on fighting France and the British, which at first they were able to do pretty successfully. But with the entrance of the Americans, it really turned the tide in the favor of the Allies, and the Germans were really stuck between a rock and a hard place. So the war ends November 11th, 1918. It was the 11th month of the 11th day of the 11th hour. So if you ever hear the phrase, it was completed in the 11th hour, this is where it comes from. Now, what stopped the fighting was the signing of an armistice. And an armistice is simply just that. It's an agreement to stop fighting. There is no declaration of a winner. There is no declaration of a loser. It's simply all sides stop shooting, period. So no one surrendered, not even Germany. Germany had every intention to keep fighting if the Allies were going to keep fighting. So the leaders from the victorious nations, what they looked at themselves as victorious nations, met to create a peace settlement. Now, at first, Germany had every intention of joining this peace settlement, but they were not allowed to attend. More of that in just a second. In fact, Germany was looked at as the losing nation by the Allies. So we'll take a look at that in a second. Now, when we get to the peace settlement, it takes place in Versailles, France. Same Versailles that Louis XVI lived in. All right, so we're talking about the same city. In fact, it took place in the Hall of Mirrors, one of a part of Louis's former palace, which is still around as a museum, really. But anyway, this is where the conference took place. Now, Germany wasn't the only country that was snubbed. In other words, not invited and ignored at the peace conference. France and Britain, for the most part, ran the show. The U.S. was pretty heavily involved, but it became kind of clear that even the U.S. was kind of a junior partner in this peace venture. France and Britain really ran the show. This left a lot of other countries feeling a little bit bitter and betrayed, especially the ones that had fought in the war and felt that they had a place at the table. All of this bad feeling would, of course, come back to haunt the world, but we'll get to that when we start going over World War II. Now let's take a look at the basics of the treaty. The Treaty of Versailles was the peace settlement that officially ended the war and set the terms for the peace between the warring nations. Signed on June 28, 1919, 5 years to the day of the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the assassination which really touched off or provided the spark that started the war. Now, the U.S. president was Woodrow Wilson at the time, and he brought with him to this peace conference an idea of his that was called the 14 points. This was 14 conditions that Wilson wanted to add into the peace conference and really turn into, or have turned into, international law. His idea was that it would create lasting peace for Europe, and one of the most important points of the 14 points was the idea of self-determination. In other words, the right to choose your own government. And this was supposed to apply to all nations. Now, as far as stuff beyond the 14 points, the Treaty of Versailles established what was called the League of Nations. This was the precursor to the United Nations today. In fact, that's where the UN got the idea, is from the League of Nations, which ultimately ended up being a failure, but it was nonetheless an idea that came out of World War I. And the League of Nations was supposed to be a band of nations from all over the world that would come together and act as a peacekeeping force, both peacekeeping in idea and, if necessary, peacekeeping by sending in troops. The main goal of it was to prevent future wars. All right, the Great War, aka World War I, was such a disastrous war, so devastating for so many nations and people and societies, that everybody involved sought a solution in which there would never be another war again. Now, Germany was not allowed into the League of Nations. All right, so not only are they excluded from the peace negotiations, but they're also excluded from this League of Nations. Since they were looked at as having lost the war, the Allies felt that Germany had nothing to say. And even the U.S. Senate eventually did not ratify or accept the treaty, both the Treaty of Versailles or the idea of the League of Nations, because, well, you'll get into a little bit more of that as juniors when you take U.S. history. But basically it came down to some disagreements between the U.S. President and the U.S. Senate, which is part of our Congress. So America ended up not accepting the Treaty of Versailles, nor the idea of the League of Nations, and we did not join the League of Nations. Now, another part of the treaty was a huge punishment for Germany. Okay, now Germany, for their part, they referred to this as the Diktat, or the dictated peace. In other words, peace was told to them how it was going to work. They had no say in what peace was going to look like. Now we'll take a quick look here at the Big Four. The Big Four were to the top right-hand corner there. Georges Clemenceau from France. We had David Lloyd George from Britain, Great Britain. Clemenceau was the Prime Minister for France, and Lloyd George the Prime Minister for Britain. We have Woodrow Wilson, the President of the USA, and then we have Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister from Italy. Remember, Italy had changed sides shortly after the beginning of the war from the Triple Alliance, who eventually became the Central Powers. Italy switched over to the Allies. So that's the Big Four. These are the main people that will negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. Now, France and Britain were, of course, furious over the war. They had lost millions of troops. Many of their towns, particularly the cities of Verdun, vast territory throughout France and Belgium had been destroyed. Also some territory in Germany, remember the Western Front. Great Britain, though they had lost no territory, or none of their land had been destroyed over on the British Isles, still they had lost a a great deal of troops, a great number of troops. So they were pretty bitter too. And both of them pointed to Germany as the main problem here. So Clemenceau wanted two things: French security, so in other words, no more German aggression. All right, Clemenceau did not want Germany to come in and mess with them anymore. They had messed with them back in 1870, and they had messed with them again in the Great War. So they were done with Germany being the aggressors. They wanted huge punishment for Germany, and Clemenceau would insist on it. Lloyd George, he also wanted European security in general, not just for France. Great Britain especially wanted the reestablishment of trade, since their commerce is wholly dependent on international trade. Remember, Great Britain is an island. They also wanted punishment for Germany, to teach Germany a lesson, though their ideas for punishment were not as harsh as those of France. Okay, a little bit more on the ferocity or the bitterness over the war. Now, what the U.S. wanted was the inclusion of Wilson's 14 points. They wanted to see his 14 points in the Treaty of Versailles, which, again, called for self-determination. In other words, all governments, all nations having the right to choose their own form of government. The U.S. wanted freedom of the seas. They wanted to go back to trade without a war going on. So there, the U.S. and Great Britain had some common ground. However, France and Britain said no to self-determination. Remember, both of these nations are empires. France has a very large empire throughout Africa and also over in Southeast Asia. Britain has parts of Southern Asia, Southeast Asia, Africa, and don't forget Canada. All right, so Great Britain has really a far-flung empire over many parts of the globe. So self-determination isn't going to work for them. They are empires. They're not ready to give any of their colonies independence. So, of course, they're not going to let them have self-determination. So France and Britain right away say no way to self-determination. All right, big point of disagreement between Wilson and his allies with the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Orlando from Italy, what he wanted from the treaty is, with the Austro-Hungarian Empire now being broken up, because they were definitely one of the losers, remember the Central Powers lost. So the Austro-Hungarian Empire is being broken up, and Italy wants some territory from that former empire. They ended up with very little of what they wanted, and eventually left the Versailles peace process very bitter, very upset, and Italy really distrusted its allies, both France and Britain, to a lesser extent America, but mostly Orlando was kind of done with Clemenceau from France and Lloyd George from Britain. Okay, if we take a look at this political cartoon, at the bottom it says Clemenceau, in parentheses, to the German delegates. Take your seats, gentlemen. So we have Clemenceau here as the waiter or maitre d'. And notice that we have, we have German delegates here. But notice the chairs. What does it look like they have on them? Notice all the food. Okay, notice the items here on the table. They're called shackles. Basically heavier, even more uncomfortable versions of handcuffs. So take a second, look at it. Yeah, we see that the chairs are full of spikes. It's spiky looking food. Food that looks like it has like spines or quills, like from a porcupine sticking out. Okay, so all of it is, at the very least, bitter to eat, and at the worst, very dangerous to eat. So the political cartoon is putting forth the idea that Clemenceau is forcing the Treaty of Versailles down the throats of the Germans, which this cartoon isn't far off. That's really what they were doing. Now, the treaty did a number of things before it punished Germany. It, of course, officially ended the war. It broke up the Central Powers, so Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Empire were no longer allies. The Ottoman Empire was being broken up into its individual Arab, Bedouin, and otherwise non-Turkish states. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was being broken up into the various peoples that had previously made it up. So it's being broken up into Austria, into Hungary, into Czechoslovakia, into parts of what is known today as Poland. All right, so all of these countries are starting to kind of appear out of the former Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now, punishment for Germany was one of the biggest parts of the treaty, especially for France and Britain. First off, Germany was to lose tons of territory. Alsace and Lorraine were to go back to France. Remember, Alsace and Lorraine were the territories taken from France by Germany when France lost the Franco-Prussian War back in 1870. Now France is getting it back. The Rhineland, which is in the western part of Germany, not only is it a very proud chunk of German land, but it has high industrial value. Lots of coal and iron found there that can be dug out of the ground and used for industrial purposes. Germany was to lose all of its overseas colonies. So not only were they losing access to all kinds of resources, but they were also losing that great power status. Some real thorns in the side for Germany here. Now, some strict restrictions were also to be put on the German military. They were to have no air force, so no more military planes for Germany at all. No more navy. Remember, this was one of the big points that Kaiser Wilhelm tried to beat Britain on. Well, now Germany's navy was being taken away from them, and they were only allowed to have a defensive army. No longer an army that would be big enough to march and invade, only for defensive purposes. Basically, a National Guard, and that's it. All right, this is really emasculating for Germany, okay? Because Germany, again, they were highly militaristic, so huge amounts of pride in their military. And taking that away, it's basically like castrating the country, all right? Taking away their manhood, if you will. And then one of the biggest of all, and this is the worst of all for Germany, is Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, otherwise known as the War Guilt Clause. In short, Germany had to accept full responsibility for the start, the fighting, and the end of the war. Think about that. Germany didn't even really start things. Austria-Hungary and Serbia did. Russia kind of helped there. But because France and Britain have such a hatred for Germany at this time, they force Germany to take complete and full blame for the entire World War I, for the entire Great War. As ridiculous as that sounds, France and Great Britain forced Germany to accept this blame. If not, France and Britain told them, all right, we're going to invade right now and we're going to annihilate you. Germany, now that they had signed the armistice, had powered down their weapons in anticipation of being able to participate in the peace process, now they're no longer in such a great condition to fight. France and Britain would have been able to exact a heavy toll on Germany. So Germany had to accept these jacked up terms. Now, from the German perspective, they felt that they had just been defending themselves against French and British aggression. Now, we know that's, of course, not quite the case. Okay, Germany certainly had some blame in the war, but they weren't the only ones. France, Great Britain, even the U.S., Belgium, Russia, all the countries involved, they all had a part of blame in the war. But because of this clause, because of this article in the treaty, Germany was forced to accept full 100% blame for the war. Now, this is the Rhineland, a part of Germany, here in the yellow. This is a part of Germany that was stripped away from Germany and given to the Allies. Belgium got a piece of it, France got a piece of it, and Germany lost all rights to this land because of the Treaty of Versailles. Almost as bad as the war guilt clause was reparations. Reparations is when someone has to pay money, or in land, usually money though, because of some kind of international loss. And with the loss of the war, or at least Germany being forced to accept not only loss but also blame for the war, they were also forced to pay the Allies the cost to fight the war. $33 billion to be precise. Okay, an amount that Germany, of course, didn't have to pay at the time. They didn't have that kind of money, nor would they have that kind of money for a while. Now, this bill put against Germany ended up really destroying the German economy. And much to Germany's credit, a little bit later on into the 20s, they're actually able to build things back up so that they were able to pay off this reparations just in time for the Great Depression to hit. Okay, so getting a little ahead of ourselves there, Germany is able to really make, life gave them some lemons, so they made lemonade. All right, but these reparations, it's a terrible bill that the Germans have to pay, but they are forced to pay it. So you can imagine that the Germans are absolutely bitter and furious over this treaty. They feel that they are getting stabbed right in the back. They feel like they're getting railroaded. To an extent, their feelings are justified. They kind of did get railroaded by the Allies here, particularly France and Britain. Now, no one would forget. No one in Germany would ever forget the Treaty of Versailles. No one in Germany would ever forget the treatment by the French and the British. And many of them, in fact, most of them, would never forgive. Hitler, a young failed painter named Adolf Hitler, fought for the Germans in World War I. He was hurt in a gas attack. He convalesced in a hospital, got well just in time to go back to the front to fight again when the war ended. And as he's now a soldier with nothing to do, nowhere to go, he's now looking at this Treaty of Versailles, and if you can imagine, the most deepest sense of hatred is just starting to boil and cook inside of his own heart. And so he looked at the Treaty of Versailles as the ultimate betrayal and the ultimate dishonor by France and Britain, especially France. And Hitler, of course, is one of those guys that will never forget and will never forgive. Okay, so you can take a look at this rather unique image here. We have a shackled prisoner, okay, 231, the article number of the War Guilt Clause. This guy's buried in the wall. He's got all these shackles, and then this buzzard, or otherwise known as a vulture, representing the treaty, is just picking away at his flesh and slowly eating him away. All right, so one artist's take on Germany's perspective of the Treaty of Versailles. All right, if we take a quick look here, we have Europe before World War I, just before World War I. We have the nations we're familiar with. When we take a look at at Europe after the war, the biggest difference, of course, is the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. This in here was all the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now it's Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, or excuse me, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia. Okay, so Austria-Hungary ceased to exist, and it was broken up into those individual nations. Germany, of course, lost land, and the rest of the nations, with the exception maybe of Russia, remained more or less the same. Now, unknown at the time of the treaty, the harsh treatment of Germany, as well as the other provisions of the Treaty of Versailles that left many nations out of the peace process, would be the biggest factors in what became known as the rise of the totalitarians in Europe, but also the rise of totalitarianism in Japan. The rise of totalitarianism in Europe, we're talking about Mussolini in Italy, we're talking about Hitler in Germany, we're talking about Franco in Spain, we're talking about Stalin in Russia, and then the military and the emperor in Japan. All right, these nations would not really come together, but on their own, they would start to create new forms of government that would really start to take Europe down a dark path. And really, the Treaty of Versailles, its provisions, and most of all its failures, really laid the groundwork on what would be a major cause of World War II. All right, so this will conclude the lecture for the end of World War I and the Treaty of Versailles. Don't forget to compose your questions along the left-hand margin, your summaries along the bottom, and I will collect all of these notes when I collect your presentations, your World War I presentations on Monday. All right, have a great night, guys, and we'll see you in class.